Thank you all for being here. This is amazing. You are all amazing. I'm really thrilled to be here in my adopted hometown. And I am particularly grateful that this invitation has provided me the overdue opportunity to ruminate a little bit on the past year, the publication of my first book, and how on earth I am standing here before all of you. Ruminating is something I did very little of last year, a year that I can only describe as completely bonkers. Professionally, 2016 was certainly the best, the most thrilling year of my life. Personally, it was a little upending. The only thing I can compare it to is being knocked down by a rogue wave and desperately trying to figure out how to swim to shore while everyone on shore is yelling, "Are you having the best year of your life?" I am so petrified of sounding ungrateful when I say something like that because I'm not. I am grateful with every bone of my body. But I joked a lot to my editor last year that I always thought novelist was a good career choice for someone who didn't like being the center of attention. And so much of the attention was great, it was wonderful, but a lot of it also focused on me and not the book. And I get that, because writing happens behind closed doors. Nobody's watching you, nobody cares for a long time, maybe forever. And let's face it looks an awful lot like binge watching The Americans. It has this air of mystery around it, so when people have the chance to talk to writers, they want to know things. They want to know things about you and about your life. There are two things that everyone wants to know about me. The secret of being, as one article memorably put it, the oldest living debut novelist. Which is not true, by the way. The secret of my overnight success. So here we go. Nora's introduction was lovely, but it is the sanitized version of my overnight success. And so for the first time today, I'm going to tell you the real story. We begin in 1986, where I was living in New York City and working as a corporate communications writer because I'd been a journalism major. The reason I was a journalism major instead of an English major is because it was practical. I grew up in a very middle-class suburban environment, and I didn't know anyone who went to college to pursue their artistic passion or to become an artist. You went to college to get a degree that was going to give you a good job and maybe the opportunity to have a slightly better, little easier life than your parents. I didn't know people who were writers or artists. My dad wrote books. He was a management consultant and he wrote business books, but he wrote them on his spare time and they provided our family in Rochester, New York with very small luxuries like a summer vacation in Toronto. Get a marketable skill was the advice I got when I was picking my major. And to be honest, I also wanted a marketable skill because what I wanted most of all after graduation was a life in New York City. I had wanted to move to New York City since I was 11, when our family took a trip there. I would wake up before everyone else and sit in the window at the New York Hilton and watch the city come to life. I would watch the taxis come in, and I would watch the lights go on in the corporate office buildings that I could see, and the people come to work, and the rushing pedestrians, and the carts where you could buy a hot dog and chocolate milk in a bottle, and I looked around and thought, these are my people. And my journalism degree got me to New York City within weeks of graduating from college. It also got me, in quick succession, 3 soul-deadening jobs. And by the time I was 26, I wanted very badly to go to graduate school and write anything that was not an article about the corporate blood drive. I thought maybe I'd be a good magazine writer, but in my deepest heart of hearts, I wanted to write fiction. So I studied for the GREs, sent away for the applications, but I could not, for the life of me, figure out how to stay in New York, work, pay for graduate school, and sleep. Many people do figure that out, of course. I was just not one of them. So my overnight success begins with taking the GREs at 26, sending away for a bunch of graduate school applications, looking at the cost and freezing. But then I thought, well, I don't have to go to graduate school. Maybe I can organize my life in a way that will be conducive to writing. So I quit my day job and moved to a very cheap apartment in Queens, which was tragically unhip, took a job at the Waldorf Astoria as a telephone operator. Ditto. My idea was to work the night shift and leave my days free to write. If that sounds a little casual and haphazard, it's because it was a lot casual and haphazard. I am also very sorry to say that I typed up a letter announcing my plan to become a real writer, made multiple copies, and mailed it to literally every single person I knew. I am even sorrier to report that because this was the 1980s, the letter was written in the style of Jay McInerney's Bright Lights, Big City. You are not the type of girl who gets up in the morning and puts on patent leather pumps. So that right there is the actual secret to becoming the world's oldest living debut novelist. One of the first things I did in my new life as a writer was get a Radio Shack credit card and buy the Tandy 1000, which was basically just a word processor. And I would get up every morning, make coffee, read the New York Times from start to finish, putter around, cook a little, finally turn on the Tandy and play solitaire. Sometimes I would type out the lyrics to songs I really loved so I could memorize them perfectly. Very often I would write angry missives to my boyfriend that I would never deliver. I did not write fiction. Writing is hard. And I was young. Looking back, I was a very young 26, 27, 28. I didn't really have any idea how to do the thing I wanted to do. So what I did for the next 5 to 6 years was make a lot of excuses for why I wasn't writing. Some of them were even true. Working as a telephone operator at night, while occasionally fascinating, did not lend itself to creativity during the day. I was constantly broke and worried about money. I got sick and my health insurance was crappy and I had undiagnosed mononucleosis, which led to chronic strep throat, and I ended up having my tonsils out by the meanest surgeon in New York City. Still, very successful writers have endured much, much worse. I did do some positive things. I took classes because I knew community was important, and that was much harder to find before the internet. But I never met anyone I really clicked with, and all my attempts at writing just petered out, mainly because everything I wrote was so disappointing to me. I judged my writing so harshly and disappointed myself so consistently that it's a bit of a miracle that I let the mirage last as long as I did. Many years later, I heard Ira Glass describe something that so perfectly mirrored my experience it took my breath away. You can easily find this on the internet. It's become a bit of a meme, but I'm going to read part of it to you, because if someone had said this to me at 28, or at 30, or 35, or 40, I think I would have listened and it would have made a difference. This is Ira. Nobody tells this to people who are beginners, all of us who do creative work. We get into it because we have good taste, but there's this gap. For the first couple of years you make stuff, it's just not that good. It's trying to be good, it has potential, but it's not. But your taste is still killer, and your taste is why your work disappoints you. Many people never get past this phase. They quit. Most people I know who do interesting creative work went through years of this. We know our work doesn't have this special thing that we want it to have. If you are just starting out or if you're still in this phase, you have to know it's normal, and the most important thing you can do is do a lot of work. It's only a volume of work that will help you close that gap, and then your work will be as good as your ambitions. The one thing I did during all those years of not writing was read. My already voracious reading habit multiplied by a factor of 1,000,000. I read everything I could get my hands on. novels, nonfiction, literary journals, magazines, as much as I could afford, because reading was also a lot more expensive before the internet. So many times what I was reading would light something on fire in my brain and in my heart, and I would rush to the Tandy 1000, turn it on, wait 5 to 7 minutes for it to boot up, start to type, and freeze. And eventually, all those rushing starts and stops led me to what felt like a very logical conclusion, that I wasn't talented enough to write fiction. So the story I started to tell myself, and everyone I sent that letter to, was that my noble experiment proved I loved fiction, but as a reader, not as a writer. The story I told everyone was that I tried fiction writing and I just didn't like it. But what I told myself was that I had failed. The truly great thing that came out of those years is that I built a decent freelance career, one that got me out of the Waldorf Astoria and kept me employed as a freelance writer for decades. So I added that to my story when I was forced to tell it, because by then I really tried not to talk about those years. So the story became, I tried writing fiction, I didn't like it just as a reader, but lo and behold, I discovered that I didn't mind corporate writing if I could do it at home. And that was true. Before I knew it, 10 years had gone by. We had 2 babies, and like nearly everyone else in the 90s, we moved to Park Slope, Brooklyn, which is the literary residential headquarters of New York City. And there I became friends with real writers. Many people I'd read and admired for so long, and now they were my fellow school parents, or we were working together at the co-op. And sometimes after an impassioned discussion about a new book or a recent article or an emerging writer, I would feel that old tug, the desire to write something personal, something that came from me. But that early failure dogged me. It clung to me. So much shame had been attached to that early attempt that the thought of trying again was paralyzing. Plus, I thought I had just missed the chance. I thought the big clubhouse of real writers had a big sign on its door that said, "Keep out, middle-aged lady." So the story I told myself during those years, as I supported friends in their writing projects and commiserated with their rejections and celebrated the publications, was that I loved being a good literary citizen, and being adjacent to the world of books was enough. I am a good literary citizen, and that's enough. I would practically chant that, walking home from a friend's reading, trying to come up with some good taglines for the meeting the next day for the software company that wanted us to rebrand all their performance products using the visuals and vocabulary of war. For the record, I think being a good literary citizen is enough unless you're totally and completely lying to yourself. My kids got older, and one day I looked up, and the flexibility of freelance work was no longer the thing I needed most from a job. We had a relocation to the West Coast looming, and I started to think about what I was going to do all day, from 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. while my kids were at school in a strange city, down 25 years worth of friends. This was all still brewing in my head while we were living in New York, and one day I picked up the Sunday Times magazine. They had just started a now defunct feature that was a humorous essay called True Life Tales. The one I read that day was by Elizabeth Gilbert, and it was about going to a meat raffle in Minnesota with her sisters. It was funny and quirky and voice-driven. It was a page, and I thought, I can do this. So I sat down and wrote one. Then I asked around and found who the editor was, and I got his email. A good advantage to living in Park Slope. Then I sent the essay to him. The editor of that page, the wonderful, hilarious John Hodgman, liked what I wrote, and we worked on making it better. And at that moment, I sort of got a glimpse of a life that I wanted, which was me sitting in a room by myself, writing something I wanted to write, and then handing it to a kind, gracious, supportive person who would help me make it better. John's boss didn't like it, and so it didn't get published. But he told me to resubmit. He told me that he would love to publish something I wrote. That exchange 2005 was the next big moment in my overnight success. That a person I did not know personally but admired very much told me he thought I was a good writer. This encouragement, and I still remember the sentence, "We all agree you are a very fine writer," came in an email with the New York Times attached to it. And that was thrilling. And though it took almost a year for me to resubmit something new, when I did, John accepted it. And 3 weeks later, when the Sunday Times landed on my Brooklyn front stoop with a thud, my byline was inside, and that was that. So if there is any actual overnight quality to my story, that's probably it. That essay in the New York Times empowered me to order my 45-year-old self to believe a new story, that it was time for me to write what I wanted to write. So I just wrote a best-selling novel, right? Those old humiliations die hard. So I did not just flip a switch and start writing novels. I eked out some essays over a couple of years. Some of them I liked, but I quickly realized how little I enjoyed writing about myself and how little I wanted to write about the people in my life. Yet I continued to insist to anyone who asked, included my befuddled spouse, who had been encouraging me to write fiction since the days of the Tandy 1000, that I could not write fiction. Then one day, I asked a friend to read an essay I was struggling with, a friend who had her MFA from a prestigious program and who was writing and publishing short stories, and she said, "I think you should write this as a short story." And I said, this was wrote by then, "Oh, I don't write fiction." She said, "What are you talking about?" So I said it again, more firmly, "I don't write fiction. I tried it once. It's not my thing." Speaking to me a little slowly like I was a dim-witted child, she said, "Just write this essay, put it in the third person, and you can add things that you get to make up." So I did. I wrote the essay as a story, kind of. It was about 10 pages and just had a beginning and an end and no middle, and it was very bad. But 2 paragraphs were not bad. So I kept reading those 2 paragraphs and thinking, I would not be embarrassed for anyone to read these 2 paragraphs. The difference between my 28-year-old self and my 48-year-old self was that I looked at those paragraphs for long enough and thought, okay, throw out all the bad ones and write more good ones. The difference between 28 and 48 was that I knew if I wanted to write fiction, I had to go all in. The difference between 28 and 48 was that I knew I had to create structure and deadlines and really find community. The big difference between 28 and 48 was that I had lived a life. I'd fallen in love and created a good marriage. I'd had children, ran our family and a freelance job, managed projects, met deadlines, responded to inane client feedback, managed house moves and renovations and school admissions. I'd negotiated salaries and schedules and snacks for the soccer team. So I knew how to get some shit done. The difference between being 28 and 48 was that I knew if I wrote pages that I hated, it wasn't because I didn't have talent, but because I needed to try harder. By then, I almost knew one of the most important things for a writer to know. You have to write the pages you hate to get to the pages you love. So I slowly started to peel off those layers of shame and get to work. Just a few weeks ago, when I was thinking about what I could possibly say to all of you today, because I haven't talked about any of this, the poet Derek Walcott died. One of my favorite poems of his kept coming across my social media transom and tugging at me until I realized it was showing me what I needed to talk about today. The poem is one of his best known, and it's called Love After Love. The time will come when, with elation, You will greet yourself arriving at your own door and in your own mirror, and each will smile at the other's welcome and say, "Sit here and eat." You will love again the stranger who is yourself. Give wine, give bread, give back your heart to itself, to the stranger who has loved you all your life, whom you ignored for another, who knows you by heart. Take down the love letters from the bookshelf, the photographs, the desperate notes. Peel your image from the mirror. Sit, feast on your life. The greatest thing about my recent success is that it's allowed me to create compassion for my younger self, to love again that stranger, to fold her into my current self and give her a little peace. Now I am grateful to her for being a badass and fearless in ways I didn't recognize at the time. I don't see her as a failure anymore. I see her as a necessary precursor to my 50th birthday, the day I drove to the post office and dropped applications into the mail for 4 different MFA programs and finally and literally changed the trajectory of my life. I am grateful to see her again, to thank her for hanging around for 30 years and sharing in my overnight success. So to all of you, thank you for including me today, for placing me in the company of these extraordinary women, all writers I admire. Thank you for inviting me into the clubhouse. It is even more beautiful than I imagined. Thank you for calling me friend and offering me a seat at your table. Thank you. It is my honor to be here.